Hello and welcome to the complete guide to mastering the King's Indian. This is chapter number 5 and we are now going to be addressing the Petrosian variation, which is 7d5. As always, we'll be covering all of the main variations that you need to know, and I will be attaching a PGN file in the description below if you want to study these moves on your own. So with that out of the way, let's begin. So the first thing that I think will be useful to look at is the comparison between the Petrosian of d5 and the classical, where white basically castles and then plays d5 on the next move. What is the difference here? Because there's a major one that will really depict how the rest of the game will go. And that relates to the placement of the knight. In this classical variation, the knight ends up on e7, where it is a valuable piece when it comes to the kingside attack, preparing f5 and eventually coming to g6 after g5 is played, and again contributing to this kingside attack. When we compare this to the immediate d5, the Petrosian, what we're looking at today, the knight doesn't have the luxury of being an attacker on the king side. It cannot travel to e7. And therefore, instead, we're going to focus on the knight being a queenside defensive piece, and namely the c5 square, which has now been very weakened because of the push d5. This is where the knight is going to go. Via either a6 or d7, it will soon travel to c5, and it will be a very valuable piece by stopping this very quick attack that white has. So on one hand, we don't have the same firepower on the kingside attack that we're going to be trying to generate, so we have to be a little bit more creative in the way that we're going to approach our kingside attack. But at the same time, we have a great defensive stronghold on the queenside with this really nice knight posted on c5. So let's now look at the first move that we are going to play after the move d5, and surprisingly, it is not the move knight to a6 going towards c5, because rushing with this move will give white the resource and time to basically defend by playing b4. So they could go queen to c2, or even better, knight to d2, defending over e4, so that when the knight comes to c5, everything is defended, and they can kick away this knight with b4, and basically begin this expansion on the queen side while gaining tempo on the knight. And this one right here could actually be rerouted now to the queen side and help. This is very bad. We want to avoid this. So going back, how do we basically stop this from happening? Well, instead of rushing with knight a6, which would eventually allow b4, we play a5. We stop b4 from being a possibility, and now we want to reroute the knight to c5, where it will be a very strong piece and will be one which cannot be kicked away, because again, b4 is not going to be as easy to get out. So we play a5. Now here, there's a couple of different moves, and many of them will transpose. We're going to look at the main line with bishop to g5. And you can play knight a6 here, there's nothing wrong with that, but my recommendation is to begin by playing h6, just kind of questioning the bishop, seeing if they want to kind of make an inaccuracy by playing bishop d2 or bishop e3, which would basically forfeit their pressure on the king side and give us undisputed control on the queen side. So we're kind of giving them that opportunity to retreat, which practically is not a great choice. So bishop h4 is almost exclusively the move that they played, but now they've committed themselves completely towards this diagonal. So we're going to play knight a6, and here white goes for the main move of castles. We will look at an alternative a little later in the video, but this is very logical, getting the king safe. And this is another important stopping point, because here black needs to make a decision that will really outline their plan in this position. You have to get rid of this pin along this diagonal if you want to get any sort of kingside attack. You can never go f5 because the knight is pinned, and so you really need to make a decision, how are we going to get rid of the pin? There's two approaches to this position. There's the very ambitious g5. There's nothing wrong with this, and then you can go knight h5, put the knight on f4. This is a little bit more positional because you don't really now have the luxury of playing f5, at least not as easily as you would otherwise, and you're playing more kind of for this stronghold, gaining some important squares, this f4 square for example. There's nothing wrong with this, it's a good alternative, but it's not what I'm recommending, because I want to go for a more direct attack, and g5, as I mentioned, does not really lend nicely to that direct kingside attack. I want to prepare f5. And so how do we prepare f5? Well, we're simply going to move the queen to e8. And the queen on e8 not only gets out of the diagonal, but it also helps defend a little along the inevitable attack that white will be forced to generate on the queen side. And again, it allows the knight to move and prepare f5. So this is kind of our plan that we're going for, keeping an eye on the queen side while simultaneously making our attack on the king side become a reality. So queen to e8, knight to d2, and here knight to h7, right? Very clear, we're going for f5. And after a3, this is another important point that I want to emphasize. A lot of people would play f5 in this position, is nothing wrong with this. This is a great move. But what you're going to see time and time again in this video by the 3 games that we're going to look at is black playing the move h5 first. Now, we're still going for f5. h5 does not stop that. It doesn't stop that at least as much as g5 would, like I showed previously. So h5, the benefit is that now the bishop can come to h6, and it will become a very valuable piece when it comes to attacking on the king side. And the reason that this is a nice addition to the attack, and the reason that we can't really do this in the classical variation, is the bishop is not needed on f8 as much, because the attack here for white, as I mentioned, is highly slowed down because of the addition of the knight on a6. So we don't need the bishop as a passive defending piece. We can bring it into the attack. So h5, but as I mentioned, we're still going for f5, and h5 does not in any way stop that from being a possibility. And in fact, now at some point we could even go g5 with tempo and just begin to completely throw our pawns at them. I find, as I mentioned, queen e8 and h5 and f5 is a bit more of a kind of typical and an effective way to generate this attack, but it is in some ways a matter of taste. So rook to b1 is what we're going to be looking at here. This was actually a game that Garry Kasparov played with the black pieces against Kramnik, and you can see that white is insisting on generating play on the queen side, which is what they have to do, but eventually the knight comes to c5, which was our plan. You might be wondering, why did they delay this move? Shouldn't you have played knight to c5 immediately before going for all of this h5, f5 idea? Well, it doesn't really matter. The engine shows that knight c5 initially was also a great alternative, but there's no reason to force that. You can first make some headway on the king side. Again, this is something that is more up to taste. So white decides that they have to generate play, and so they do this by sacrificing a pawn with b6, and then playing knight to c4, and kind of getting some compensation for that pawn. It's very logical. But here, queen to g6, setting up some ideas of an attack. You notice that the bishop is now in. There's always this threat of bringing the bishop to e3, where it will be a valuable attacker. There's the knight that can come into the attack as well. Black is setting up a pretty serious and deadly attack. So bishop to e7, taking the pawn on d6, and rook to g7, right? So white decided to spend some time taking the pawn, which gave black time to further advance their attack over here. So rook to f2 is played here, a pretty scary move to play, because notice that if the knight is ever kicked away, then bishop e3 will follow, which will be a very dangerous continuation. You cannot go b5 immediately because of bishop c5 controlling the e3 square and gaining the piece back. But that is something to keep in mind, and you'll see that later, in fact, black goes for this idea. They first bring the knight kind of into the center, bringing it back into the game, but then go b5, and once again, white does not have the luxury of moving the knight in view of bishop e3 winning on the spot. So rook to d5 was played here, giving away the piece, but then taking back the pawn on h5. But here the issue for white is there's no way to stop bishop to e3 from coming. I mean, if you move the rook, like rook to e2, but then queen takes d5 comes. I mean, the rook is attacked. If you move the rook here, then the bishop is already making contact. You can throw in bishop e3 first. I mean, black is totally taking control. The rook can come to the f8 square as well. It's game over. Black is like -10 here. So white decided to, in fact, resign after queen to e6 and bishop e3. They threw in the towel. So let's take a step all the way back. This was a nice game. You can kind of see how the attack really played itself with this h5, bishop to h6. This was a huge integral part of this attack. The threats that black had simply would not be as powerful if bishop e3 was not an idea. So that is why h5 is super important, because again, you do not have the knight in the attack. So you're basically forced to bring in the bishop into the attack. That's the only way that the attack has a very big chance of success. Now let's take a step back, and in this position, instead of f5 from black, we'll look at bishop h6. This is just to show another game example. This one was by Hikaru with the black side. You'll see that very, very soon f5 is indeed played, because this is, again, the way that black generates the play here. They go for h5 and f5 with the bishop in the game. This is the thematic setup that you need to take away from this video to play against the Petrosian. You put a knight on the queen side, delaying the attack from white, and in the meantime, h5 and f5 are the ways that you generate your play on the king side. This is kind of the pattern that you're seeing here. And eventually, the game here ended in quite nice fashion. We had g3, kicking away the rook, and now queen to e7, threatening queen h4. Very serious threat because h3, the very thematic bishop h3, becomes an idea. First rook to a8. Notice that if you go queen to h4 too quickly, there's knight f1 and kind of defending everything for the time being. This is not too easy for white to hold still, but it's definitely possible. So first rook to a8, playing a bit flexibly, and I think this is another key takeaway from this game. The a file is open. So the rook, it wasn't really doing anything on the c file, so bringing it to the a file, giving it some more life, is a nice addition to your play, right? You can be holistic in these positions. You don't only need to focus on your kingside pressure. Now the knight comes into the attack, and there's already some pretty nice ideas. We have h4. The idea is to go h3 and just ram this pawn up the board, and it's so difficult for white to play. The rook to g1 was played as a defensive measure, but it's a very questionable defense because queen to h7 comes the second the h file opens up. And another key thing that I want to emphasize, in this position, if you open up the engine, I'll admit, white is better. The engine gives this plus 1.5. But practically, it's impossible to play this accurately. The best move here is the fearless g takes f4, allowing this open h-file attack to happen. The far more natural move that the Grandmaster played in this position was knight to f1, but this is now losing. Now it's -4. So it's so easy for white to lose control that the practical nature of this position, the practical advantage that black has, is enough compensation for the very common objective evaluation, which tends to side with white in many positions, even though they look, again, practically super dangerous to defend. So knight f1, this loses because of rook takes a6, bishop takes d2, and queen to h3, and simply taking here. There's already the idea of, taking on f3, and just crashing through completely. And here there's many different ways that you can try to approach winning this position. G2 is a great way to win and make progress, threatening, the attack on h1 and also the knight. But Hikaru decided to go king to g7, trying to swing the rook over a little bit. It's not the most effective way, and it allows white to, give some checks and try to be a little annoying, but ultimately, black is just completely winning. And that becomes clear after queen to d5. We have g2 now, and now we have f3. It's not the cleanest conversion, but this is a pretty nice checkmate to get on the board. So ladies and gentlemen, the final thing that I want to mention in this position after knight a6, a final game, instead of castles, let's look at the move knight to d2. Now, the significance of this move is not very obvious, it's not very significant, and most often white will end up castling anyways, but the intention is to somewhat put more pressure immediately on the king side to make the attacks that we were going for less possible. But as you'll see, that doesn't really actually happen. We can still go for the same basic and fundamental idea, and queen to e8 is what starts all of that as a reminder to be able to move the knight and advance with f5. We have bishop d7, we have knight h7, we have h5. The attack is exactly the same. It's a copy and paste situation. h5, bishop h6, f5, knight h7. You go queen to e8 to get out of the pin. These are the basic ideas that I'm recommending that has been applied, as you can see, in many, many Grandmaster games. This one here is Rajabov with the black side. You put the knight on c5 to, for the time being, stop the attack. And even though at some point they're going to go b4, it comes at the surrender of this a file for black. So black gets some play on the queen side as well. As you will very soon see, knight to a4. We have knight to d1. And black expands. Now, I should note that Rajabov kind of went for the wrong plans here. They played a little bit on the queen side with c5, and then as you'll soon see with c5 again, it's not really what the position calls for. You have huge advantage on the king side with the space. This is what you want to be playing for. So instead of going like c5 in this position, taking here or going like queen to g7, for example, You can also like move the king to get the rook into the game. Those are kind of the basic ideas and ways that black can make progress on their attack. Playing on the queen side, it's something you want to do with huge caution because this is where white tends to be stronger. So c5, knight to b6. Again, black gains control over the a file. Playing on both sides of the board, you have a massive advantage on the king side. And now, pretty nice stable position on the queen side as well. We eventually advance with g5. The ending to this game is really pretty. You're going to see some nice tactics. Knight to g4 kind of begins all those tactics. If you take, then f3 check will regain the material with interest. There's also the pressure on the rook here, so you can now take with check and then take the rook. Everything is collapsing for white, so they did not take the knight. They moved their knight to b1 instead, and here they're attacking the rook, so if you take the bishop, they'll take your rook. So Rajabov gave away the rook, but then got 2 pieces in return with a continuing attack, and that's the key. We had bishop to d3, now queen to f7, and knight back to g4. You can still not take for the same reason as before. The bishop becomes too active, and the rook on c1 becomes very vulnerable. The knight eventually uses this g4 square to reroute to e3. Now, materially, it's quite a imbalanced position. Black has the 2 pieces for the rook, but also quite a bit of pawns. Objectively, like if you're counting the material, they're up 2, but that's not even where their advantage lies. If you look at their advantage, it's because of their dominant position in the center. All of these dark squares, the king is weak. You can eventually swing pieces to the a file. The knights are really strong, kind of dominating across the board. So black is completely winning. -4 is what the engine gives this position. And the best part is, white has no attack whatsoever. h4, and you can't make any progress. There's no way to basically stop this control that black has here. They're dominating across the entire board. So it took some maneuvering, it took some, playing around a little, rerouting, but eventually the pawns began to push down the board. Black began to make some very significant progress, and here white resigned because they tried to kind of scare black into not taking the rook because of the threat of the perpetual, but it's a threat that is simply non-existent because you can play for one bishop g5 or even just kind of run away with your king. So black indeed won the game by resignation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will end the video for today. A nice, very thematic way that I recommend you approach these positions, which, as a reminder, involves playing queen to e8 to get out of the pin, going knight to h7 to prepare f5, and playing, very importantly, h5 to allow the bishop to be that extra attacking piece that you very desperately need. And on the meantime, playing on the queen side with knight a6, first going a5, gaining control over the c5 square, putting the knight there, and not just giving away the queen side completely to your opponent, but instead contesting the open a file, which very likely will indeed open up. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe if you are new around here, like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.